People often say love is blind. What they don't say is how cruelly it opens its eyes when society gets involved. On a quiet winter evening, in a small government office filled with the smell of old files and ink, Roy sat behind a wooden desk. That had seen better days. He was a clerk. Nothing more, nothing less. His salary barely covered rent and groceries, but his heart carried ambitions far heavier than his pockets. He believed in honesty, patience, and effort. And most dangerously of all, he believed in love. That belief had a name. Helen. She was a university student, intelligent, ambitious, and impossibly bright. Where Roy's life moved in slow, measured steps, Helen's future ran ahead of her like a river chasing the sea. They met by chance, grew closer through conversations, laughter, and shared silences, and soon discovered something rare between them: natural chemistry, effortless and sincere. Roy never hid who he was. A clerk, a nobody in society's eyes. Helen knew it, and she accepted him anyway. When Roy finally gathered the courage to ask her to marry him, his hands trembled more than his voice. Helen didn't hesitate. She said yes, not because of money, not because of status, but because she liked the man he was. For Roy, that single word felt richer than any promotion. But fate has a cruel habit of testing happiness at its weakest. Moments. Just days before the wedding, Helen's examination results arrived. They changed everything. Helen hadn't just passed, she had topped. With her score, she was eligible to become a high-ranking officer, someone who could enter elite circles, government power, and a life Roy had never even imagined touching. The news spread fast. Faster than joy. Faster than pride. Her sister found out first, then her friends, then her parents. And with the news came poison disguised as concern. Why marry a clerk now? You deserve someone of your level. Do you know how people will laugh? You can marry anyone from the elite class now. Helen resisted at first. She defended Roy. She reminded them that love wasn't a transaction. But pressure is powerful when it comes from every direction: family, society, fear, ambition. Slowly, painfully, doubt began to settle in her heart. On the day of the wedding, when Roy stood surrounded by guests, nervous but hopeful, Helen made her choice. She ran. No explanation. No confrontation. Just a message. I'm sorry. I can't do this. Roy arrived at the wedding hall smiling, and left it broken. People whispered. Relatives laughed. Friends mocked. Know your status. A clerk should dream within limits. Roy's parents stood frozen in shame, their heads lowered under the weight of humiliation they did not deserve. And Roy, once proud, once hopeful, felt something inside him collapse forever. That night, he didn't cry loudly. He broke silently. He learned a lesson society teaches mercilessly. A clerk has no worth, no respect, no value, unless he becomes something more. But instead of drowning in grief, Roy did something dangerous. He turned his pain into fuel. And somewhere else, unaware of what her decision had truly cost, Helen stepped into a future that would one day drag her back to the very man she had left behind. Because time does not forget. And power has a strange way of changing hands. If you believe love should never be measured by status, if you've ever been judged by your position, follow, like, share, and comment. Stay with the story, because the tables will turn. Part 2. When ambition chooses for you, Helen did not look back when she ran from her own wedding. The morning air felt heavier than usual as she stepped into a taxi, her bridal bangles hidden beneath a shawl, her phone vibrating endlessly with missed calls. She refused to answer. Every ring felt like an accusation. Every vibration reminded her of the face she had chosen not to see. Roy. She told herself she was doing the right thing. She told herself this pain was temporary. She told herself ambition demanded sacrifice. But deep inside, something screamed that she had just destroyed the only honest thing she had ever owned. Days passed. Then weeks. Helen moved forward exactly as everyone expected her to. She prepared for interviews, cleared formalities, and soon stepped into a world of authority she had once only imagined. when the appointment letter arrived declaring her future. As a government officer, her parents celebrated. Her sister smiled with pride. Her friends congratulated her with envy disguised as affection. Yet every night, alone in her room, Helen stared at her phone. She typed Roy's name more times than she could count. She never pressed call. Roy, meanwhile, disappeared. After the humiliation of that wedding day, he cut himself off from the world that had mocked him. He stopped attending gatherings. He avoided old friends. He left the town quietly, carrying only his parents' blessings and a wound that refused to heal. But Roy did not run to forget. He ran to rebuild. He enrolled again in studies he had once abandoned because life demanded survival over dreams. He studied at night, after long office hours, fueled by rejection and rage. Every insult replayed in his mind like a lesson carved into stone. A clerk has no respect. A clerk has no value. A clerk must know his limits. Roy decided his limits would no longer be decided by others. Years passed. Helen's life transformed on the surface. She lived in a large government residence, driven by a uniformed driver, saluted by staff who feared her authority. Her salary grew. Her name carried weight. Doors opened when she entered rooms. But something strange happened. No one ever came close. Proposals arrived. Wealthy men. Influential families. Elite matches. She rejected them all. Some out of pride. Some out of fear. Some because no matter how powerful she became, none of them made her feel the way Roy once had when he listened to her without agenda. Sometimes guilt crept in quietly. Late at night, she would remember her sister's words, her friend's pressure, her parents' disappointment, and realize she had chosen society's approval over her own heart. She tried contacting Roy. Once, twice, many times. Every call went unanswered. Every message remained unseen. Roy had blocked her. That realization hurt more than any insult ever could. On the other side of the country, Roy's life was changing too, slowly, steadily, and with brutal discipline. He passed exams people said were impossible for someone like him. He earned respect through results, not connections. His silence became his strength. He did not talk about Helen, but she lived in every decision he made. By the time 5 years had passed, both of them had become different people, shaped by ambition, regret, and unresolved pain. They believed their paths would never cross again. They were wrong, because destiny, unlike people, never forgets unfinished stories, and soon, an accusation would shake Helen's perfect world, one that would place her future in the hands of the very man she once abandoned. Power has a way of convincing people they are untouchable. Helen had begun to believe it too. 5 years into her career, she was known for her strict discipline and unshakable authority. Files moved fast under her command. Subordinates feared disappointing her. Her name carried enough weight to silence arguments before they began. To the world, she was a success story. A woman who had risen high through intelligence and determination. But power also attracts shadows. One ordinary afternoon, while Helen was reviewing documents in her office, a sealed envelope arrived from the State Department. The paper felt heavier than it should have in her hands. As she read the contents, the room seemed to tilt. She was being accused of accepting a $5 million bribe, effective immediately. She was suspended pending investigation. Helen's breath caught. Her hands trembled for the first time in years. She read the letter again, searching for a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything. There was none. The language was cold, final, merciless. By evening, the news had already spread. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Phones stopped ringing. The same system that had lifted her now distanced itself with terrifying speed. Her government house, once a symbol of authority, felt like a cage filled with echoes of doubt. That night, Helen didn't sleep. Fear replaced pride. Silence replaced power. She replayed every decision she had made, every document she had signed. Slowly, horrifyingly, names surfaced in her mind. Her closest friend, the one she had trusted enough to bring into her department. The friend who handled sensitive paperwork. The friend she had never doubted. Trust, Helen realized, could be more dangerous than enemies. A week later, another letter arrived. She was ordered to appear before the investigating officer the next morning. Helen reached the office early, dressed with forced confidence. The corridors felt colder than before. Staff whispered. Her footsteps echoed like a countdown. When the investigation officer entered the room, Helen looked up, and her world collapsed. It was Roy. For a moment, time froze. The clerk. The man she had abandoned. The man society had once mocked, now seated. In power. Roy didn't recognize her immediately, or perhaps he pretended not to. His posture was calm, controlled. His eyes, once warm, were unreadable. Years of struggle had sharpened him into something formidable. Helen stood there, stunned. Roy glanced at her file, then at her. Were you told to sit? He asked coldly. The words struck harder than any slap. Helen remained standing, her throat dry. She saw it clearly now. The tables had turned completely. The power she once held over him no longer existed. And the man who once loved her was now in a position to decide her fate. Roy leaned back slightly, his voice steady. So, he said, you needed to rise quickly. I suppose small people were never enough for you. Helen tried to speak, to explain, to defend herself. But So, he said, you needed to rise quickly. I suppose small people were never enough for you? Helen tried to speak, to explain, to defend herself, but the past stood between them like a wall. The pain she had ignored had returned wearing authority, and Roy, once broken and humiliated, now held the pen. Helen felt every ounce of her confidence drain away as Roy's words settled into the room. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell him how pressured she had been, how trapped she had felt, how running away had haunted her for years. But explanations sound weak when spoken from a place of guilt, especially to someone you once abandoned without a word. Never thought you were small, Helen said finally, her voice unsteady. You're wrong. Roy didn't react. He flipped through her file slowly, deliberately, as if each page carried not just evidence but memory. His silence was louder than anger. It told her something far more dangerous. He no longer needed her to understand him. $5 million, Roy said calmly. That's not an amount someone signs without knowing. I didn't take any bribe, Helen replied, desperation slipping into her tone. I would never do that. Roy looked at her then, really looked. For a brief second something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, pain, restraint. Then it vanished. Everyone says that, he replied. Sit. Helen sat. The chair felt colder than the floor of the wedding hall she had once fled. Over the next few days, Roy questioned her repeatedly. Every question felt less like an investigation and more like a mirror being held to her past. He reminded her, without directly saying it, of who he had been and what she had chosen to leave behind. Meanwhile, Helen's world continued to shrink. Her accounts were frozen. Her access restricted. Friends stopped visiting. The same people who once boasted of knowing her now avoided her name. Isolation wrapped around her like a slow suffocation. Roy, on the other hand, stood firm. Respected, feared, composed. But behind closed doors, he fought a war no file could document. Evidence began to surface that didn't fully align. Dates that felt wrong. Signatures that looked rushed. Patterns that hinted at manipulation. Something didn't add up. Late one night, Roy sat alone in his office, staring at a photo attached to Helen's file. He remembered her laughter, her stubborn honesty, the way she had once defended him when no one else did. Before she stopped, hatred had fueled him for years. Now doubt began to poison it. He dug deeper, and the truth began to whisper. Roy had always believed that truth was loud. That lies trembled. That guilt showed itself. He was wrong. The truth, he realized, was quiet, buried beneath trust and assumptions. As the investigation deepened, Roy began noticing small inconsistencies. Transaction timestamps that didn't align with Helen's schedule. Approval trails that bypassed standard protocol. Most disturbing of all were documents bearing Helen's signature. Signatures placed on files she had never personally handled. At first, Roy told himself he was overthinking. But instinct, the same instinct that had once trusted Helen blindly, now urged him to look closer. He reviewed CCTV footage. He cross-checked access logs. He traced authorizations backward instead of forward. And slowly, a familiar name kept appearing in places it shouldn't have. Helen's friend. The one she had personally recommended. The one she trusted without question. The one who had stood beside her when the world applauded. Roy's jaw tightened as the realization settled. The betrayal was cruel in its simplicity. Helen had been used. But Roy stood at a dangerous crossroads. He could close his eyes. He could finalize the case. He could let Helen fall and call it justice. No one would question him. No one would stop him. For years, he had dreamed of balance being restored, of humiliation answered with power, of proving that a clerk could rise and crush those who once looked down on him. And yet, each piece of evidence that cleared Helen's name felt like a blow to his own armor. If he exposed the truth, Helen would walk free. If he didn't, she would be ruined. Roy stared at the file long after midnight. The office empty, the city silent. For the first time in years, the question wasn't about status or revenge. It was about who he had become. Outside, rain began to fall, just like it had on the day Helen ran. And Roy knew one thing with terrifying clarity. Whatever he chose next would define him forever. Part 6. The weight of a revenge. Roy slept poorly that night. In his dreams, the wedding hall kept changing into an interrogation room. Laughter turned into whispers. Applause into accusations. Helen's face shifted between the woman he once loved and the officer now standing before him, stripped of authority and dignity. When morning came, his decision was still unresolved. Helen, meanwhile, was breaking. Days of suspension turned into weeks of isolation. She sat in her government house like a prisoner on parole, surrounded by luxury that meant nothing. The silence pressed harder than any punishment. For the first time since she had run from her wedding, she felt the full weight of what abandonment truly meant. She tried once more to reach. Roy blocked. That final rejection cut deeper than the investigation itself. In the investigation room, Roy's demeanor grew colder. He questioned Helen harshly, publicly, professionally, and sometimes unnecessarily. Each sharp remark felt like repayment for the humiliation he had endured years ago. "You trusted the wrong people," he said once, his voice flat. "Just like you trusted the wrong future." Helen lowered her eyes. She deserved this, she thought. And yet, Roy noticed something unsettling. She never begged. She never pleaded for sympathy. Her dignity remained, bruised but intact. That quiet strength reminded him painfully of why he had loved her in the first place. Then the decisive evidence arrived. A digital transfer. A hidden recording. A signed authorization captured on video. It proved beyond doubt that Helen's friend had orchestrated everything. The bribes, the documents, the deception. Helen's only crime had been trust. Roy stared at the screen, heart pounding. He had the power now. To expose the truth. Or to destroy Helen legally. And call it fate. His parents' faces crossed his mind. Their humiliation. Their lowered eyes at the wedding hall. His own silent vow that day. Never to be powerless again. Revenge felt justified. But justice felt heavier. Roy closed the file slowly. Outside, the sun rose, indifferent to his struggle. And in that light, Roy realized something terrifying. He could ruin Helen in seconds, but saving her would cost him something far greater, his hatred. The boardroom was full, yet the air felt suffocating. Helen stood at the center of the long table, surrounded by faces that once smiled at her success, and now waited for her fall. The review committee had been summoned. A final decision loomed. This was the moment where careers ended, or were erased completely. Roy sat at the head of the table, calm, controlled, unreadable. Helen's legs felt weak, but she refused to sit unless instructed. The memory of his words, "Were you told to sit?" still burned inside her. This time she stood by choice, not fear. The chairman spoke first, outlining the charges. $5 million, abuse of power, breach of trust. Each accusation felt like a stone placed on her chest. When Helen was finally allowed to speak, her voice cracked. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have," she said. "But I never took a bribe. I accept responsibility for my negligence, but not for a crime I didn't commit." Her words echoed, then faded. All eyes turned to Roy. This was it. Roy stood slowly. For a moment, Helen saw not the officer before her, but the man she had left waiting at a wedding altar. Her heart pounded as if the past itself was holding its breath. Roy began speaking, his voice steady. The investigation revealed multiple inconsistencies, he said. Helen closed her eyes. "This case," Roy continued, "is not as simple as it appears." Hope flickered. Fragile. Dangerous. But then Roy stopped. He looked directly at Helen. And said nothing more. The silence was unbearable. Helen's strength finally collapsed. Tears spilled freely as she realized the truth. Roy knew she was innocent, and he was still letting her fall. The pain of injustice was nothing compared to the realization that the man who once loved her now hated her enough to destroy her. The meeting was adjourned. Helen left the room shaking, her career hanging by a thread. That night she broke completely. Alone she cried, not for her job, not for her status, but for the irreversible damage she had done years ago. For choosing ambition over love. For trusting the wrong people. For losing the only man who had ever loved her without conditions. And Roy sat alone long after everyone had gone. His hands trembled. Because for the first time, revenge didn't feel victorious. It felt hollow. Roy did not sleep that night. The silence of his house felt heavier than the noise of any crowd. Helen's tears replayed in his mind. Not loud, not dramatic, but broken. He realized something unsettling. Punishing her had not healed him. It had only exposed how deep his wounds still were. At dawn, Roy returned to the office. This time, not as a man seeking balance, but as one seeking truth. He reopened every file, every clip, every log. He followed the money trail again, slower, sharper. And this time, he went further, beyond Helen's department, beyond her authority. What he found erased all doubt. The bribe money had been routed through shell accounts. The approvals were signed digitally using access Helen had unknowingly granted. The video evidence was undeniable. Helen's friend, the woman she had trusted like family, was the mastermind. The betrayal was complete. Roy felt something shift inside him. For years he had blamed Helen for choosing status over him. But now he saw the pattern clearly. Helen had always trusted people too easily. First her family, then society, then her friend, and finally him. By evening, Roy prepared a comprehensive report. The next board meeting was called urgently. Helen was summoned again. She entered the room numb, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. She had already lost her career and her heart. What remained was dignity, fragile, but intact. Roy stood before the board. "This investigation was incomplete," he began. "I take full responsibility for the delay." Helen looked up, stunned. Roy played the video. The room fell silent. Faces changed. Whispers spread. Shock replaced judgment. "She is innocent," Roy said firmly. "The real culprit is her associate." Helen Vale was manipulated, not corrupt. Helen's knees nearly gave way. Tears streamed down her face as relief and shame collided. Not just because she was saved, but because she finally understood what betrayal truly felt like. When the meeting ended, Helen ran after Roy. "I'm sorry," she whispered, breaking down completely. "I hurt you. I know I did. I don't expect forgiveness, but thank you for choosing what's right." Roy didn't answer. He walked away. Because saving her career was easy. Forgiving her was not. Helen was reinstated. Official apologies were issued. Statements were released. The department moved on quickly, as institutions always do. Scandals fade when truth becomes inconvenient. But guilt does not fade so easily. Helen resigned. The decision shocked everyone, her parents, her colleagues, even the board. She no longer wanted power that had cost her integrity, her peace, and the man she loved. She sold the government house, declined privileges, and chose a quieter life. And then, she made one final decision. She invited Roy to her wedding. The card was simple. No grand words. Just a date, a place, and a line written by hand. "I will not run this time." Roy stared at the card for a long time. He told himself he wouldn't go. He told himself it was too late. He told himself love didn't erase wounds. But on the wedding day, he found himself standing outside the hall, silent, conflicted, pale. Inside, Helen stood dressed as a bride. Not the powerful officer. Not the ambitious achiever. Just Helen. When she saw Roy, her breath caught. "You can't do this," Roy said quietly. "You can't marry someone else." Helen met his eyes, steady and honest. "If you don't want me," she said softly, "does that mean I must stay alone forever?" Roy had no answer. The priest raised his voice to begin the ceremony, and something inside Roy snapped. "This wedding will not happen," he shouted. Gasps filled the hall. Helen's father stood, furious. "Who do you think you are to stop this?" Roy stepped forward. And then, unbelievably, fired a shot into the air. Panic erupted. But the gun dropped from his hand. He fell to his knees before Helen. "I don't want revenge anymore," he said, voice breaking. "I want you. I always did." Silence. Then laughter. Applause. The groom stepped forward, smiling. "I'm just an actor," he said. "She paid me $500. Thankfully, she didn't pay you to shoot me." The hall erupted. Roy looked around in shock, his parents, his friends, all standing there, smiling. Helen laughed through tears. "This was never another wedding," she said. "It was ours." Roy stared at her, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Roy stood frozen as the truth finally settled into his bones. This wasn't betrayal. This wasn't manipulation. This was faith. Helen walked toward him slowly, her bridal dress brushing the floor, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in years. Certainty. Not ambition. Not fear. Just love, raw and unapologetic. "I ran once," she said softly, standing before him. "I won't ever do that again. Not from you. Not from us." Roy's parents stepped forward. His mother's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. A smile she hadn't worn since the day her son had been humiliated before an entire hall of people. His father placed a hand on Roy's shoulder, grounding him in the present. "You don't have to be strong anymore," his father said quietly. "You already proved yourself." Roy looked around. The faces that once mocked him now watched with respect. The hall that once broke him now waited in silence. The priest cleared his throat, smiling nervously. "Well," he said, "since we've already survived gunfire, I believe it's safe to continue." Laughter rippled through the room. Roy stood up, still overwhelmed, still shaken, but lighter than he had been in years. He faced Helen, the woman who had once shattered him, and now stood ready to rebuild everything she had broken. "I hated you," Roy admitted honestly. "And I hated myself for still loving you." Helen nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I deserved that," she said. "But if there's even a small part of you that believes in second chances, I promise, I'll spend my life proving I'm worthy of it." Roy took her hands. In that moment, the clerk, the officer, the bride, the broken lovers, all of it disappeared. Only two people remained. "I don't want power," Roy said. "I don't want revenge. I don't even want apologies anymore." He looked at her, his voice steady. "I want peace. With you." The priest didn't wait this time. The vows were spoken, not loudly, not dramatically, but truthfully. When Roy kissed Helen, it wasn't the kiss of a victory won, but of a war finally ended. As Roy lifted Helen in his arms and rushed toward the exit, Pretending to escape before another drama could unfold, laughter and applause followed them out into the open air. For the first time in years, Roy laughed freely. And Helen knew, truly knew, that love, when tested by fire, can still survive. Not because society allows it, but because two people finally choose each other.